It's strange. Looking back on where I started and thinking about the kind of person I was then. Bright-eyed. Maybe even a little too eager. I was one of those people who jumped at the chance to dive headfirst into work. Brimming with idealism. I had just left grad school. Carrying around that weight of expectation. With friends, family, and mentors all nudging me along toward success. Back then, success looked like the job I managed to land in that glossy building downtown. It was nothing short of impressive to my family and friends. Especially when they saw the view from my new office. The tall glass windows that overlooked a sprawling city that never really stopped moving. I remember looking down at that city from those windows. Feeling as if I'd finally made it to the starting line of the life I wanted. There's an energy that surges through you when you're just starting. I showed up early. Stayed late. And poured over projects with an enthusiasm that felt as unshakable as steel. I watched others in the office with a sense of reverence. Admiring the way they managed deadlines. Held meetings. And seemed to float from one task to another. Their steps confident and efficient. These people had experience. And I wanted to be like them. To be seen as someone others could rely on. At that time, I couldn't see the fatigue in their eyes. The lines on their foreheads. Or the weariness in their voices. All I saw was their success and I wanted it. But there's a funny thing about starting something new. Especially when you're young and convinced you're invincible. It's easy to miss the finer details. The unspoken rules and quiet compromises everyone makes. For a while, the job fit like a glove. I worked on reports, presentations, and analyses. Tackling everything that came my way as if it were the most important task in the world. Then, gradually, I started noticing cracks. Little things at first, the tight deadlines. The urgent last-minute requests. The hushed conversations in the hallways that ended abruptly when I entered. Once, I watched my manager brush off a team member's suggestion as if they hadn't spoken. I filed it away. Unsure if it was worth worrying about. Still, the idea lingered. I told myself it wasn't personal. That it was just the way things worked here. And pushed on. It wasn't long before those cracks became harder to ignore. My first big assignment was for a client presentation. And I was thrilled. I stayed up until 2 in the morning the night before. Perfecting the slides. Double-checking the numbers. And running through every detail in my mind. But the next day, when I watched my manager present, he barely glanced at the slides. I realized he hadn't reviewed them beforehand and, worse, didn't give credit where it was due. When he wrapped up, there was no acknowledgement of the hours I'd put in. No sense of teamwork or appreciation. My effort felt invisible. Still, I kept convincing myself that these things happened in every job. And that I just needed to prove my worth. My manager would see it. Eventually. And even if he didn't, maybe someone else would. So, I doubled down on my work ethic. Telling myself that the recognition would come with time. But time passed. And the recognition didn't come. It didn't take long for the dynamic in the office to shift. And in a way I couldn't have predicted. Not long after I started, my first manager left the company. He had his flaws. Sure, he could be dismissive. And sometimes I felt like an afterthought in his presentations. But at the very least, he understood the work and kept the team organized. When he left, it felt sudden. A decision made in silence and carried out without ceremony. He just wasn't there one Monday. His office door closed. The nameplate removed. That small, almost unremarkable change set off a chain of events that altered everything. Our new manager, Julia, had a different approach altogether. She was sharp and quick. A person who entered a room with a confidence that was hard to ignore. But that confidence wasn't exactly reassuring. Instead of guiding us, she issued orders. Instead of feedback, she issued critiques. I remember how the energy on the team shifted. Like everyone was constantly bracing for impact. Trying to anticipate Julia's next set of demands. For me, it felt like an initiation by fire. I had been handling my regular workload, which was already a lot. But now I was suddenly being given more complex reports. New client interactions. And tasks that I hadn't been trained for. My days grew longer. But I kept going. Motivated by the idea that if I could just prove myself in this intense environment, I'd solidify my place on the team. That optimism faded over the weeks as I realized how little support was actually there. Julia's guidance was more criticism than coaching. Instead of offering solutions or working collaboratively, she'd say things like, "I expected more from this," or "You should know better." I would stay late, poring over spreadsheets and redoing presentations. Driven less by ambition and more by the fear of failing in her eyes. The stress of it all started creeping in, tightening in my chest and keeping me awake at night. But still, I held on, convincing myself that the pressure was temporary. The extra work hours soon became my new normal. Days turned into 12-hour marathons. And weekends became extensions of the work week. I would look up from my screen and realize the office had emptied. The sky outside my window darkened. I'd walk home through the quiet streets. Exhausted but numb. Mentally replaying each task. Each comment from Julia. Wondering if I'd overlooked something or made a mistake I hadn't caught. In those moments of quiet, I could feel the job pressing down on me. Turning me into someone I hardly recognized. I started losing touch with my friends. Missing dinners and events. Or just being too tired to engage. My family's calls went unanswered. And my partner started noticing that even when I was physically present, my mind was always somewhere else. At some point, I began to realize that my personal life had started to revolve around the job. Weekends, which used to be for recharging or spending time with loved ones, became crammed with emails, last-minute reports, or worse, me just being too drained to do anything at all. I was constantly walking the line between exhaustion and resignation. Yet, I told myself that success demanded sacrifice, and that this was just a part of the process. It wasn't until I missed my sister's graduation that the first real pang of regret settled in. I had promised her I'd be there. Assured her I wouldn't miss it for anything. But the night before, a project landed on my desk with a deadline that couldn't be moved. And Julia's voice was clear in my head, "You need to get this done right." My sister's graduation went on without me. And when I finally called her later, my voice choked with guilt. She told me she understood. Her kindness only made me feel worse. The missed graduation wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a piece of me that I'd given up and could never get back. Looking back, I think it was the impossibly high-stakes project that marked the beginning of my breaking point. Julia called me into her office one Friday afternoon, just before most of the office was clearing out for the weekend. She was sitting behind her desk, scrolling through emails, barely looking up as I entered. Without much preamble, she slid a folder across the desk and told me, "I need this done by Monday." I opened the folder and felt the familiar tightening in my chest as I took in the contents. It was a major client's annual report. A project that would normally take weeks, maybe even months, of planning. The pages outlined metrics and data that were missing, analyses that hadn't been started, and recommendations that still needed to be finalized. Yet, she wanted it polished and client-ready by Monday morning. I tried to form the words to explain how unrealistic the timeline was. How I'd need more resources. More support. But I'd learned enough to know what kind of response would meet my concerns. So I kept my mouth shut and took the folder back to my desk. That weekend was a blur of numbers and exhaustion. I sat in my apartment, hunched over my laptop, surrounded by empty coffee cups and takeout containers. The hours slipping by in a fog. I didn't leave my desk. Didn't go outside. When I looked in the mirror Sunday night, I barely recognized the face staring back at me, tired eyes, unkempt hair, an expression that had grown hollow from days of stress. Somehow, I made it through, submitting the report just before sunrise on Monday. But instead of relief, I was met with more demands. Julia barely looked at me when I handed in the report. She simply skimmed the first page, muttered something about good enough and passed it along. That should have been a moment of validation for me. A pat on the back for a job well done. But I felt nothing but a bone-deep weariness. I had given everything for a project that barely registered as a blip on Julia's radar. And it was clear to me then that nothing I could ever do would be enough to satisfy her expectations. From that point on, my health took a turn. I'd never experienced anything like it before: the constant headaches, the inability to sleep despite my exhaustion, the nagging anxiety that sat heavy in my chest. The stress had seeped into my bones, turning even the simplest tasks into mountains I had to climb. There was one night, sitting in my office, that I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to step away from my desk. I staggered to the bathroom, gripping the sink to steady myself as the room spun around me. My face was pale, my hands clammy. And in that moment, I realized just how much of myself I'd sacrificed for this job. My doctor, whom I finally visited after several weeks of struggling, called it burnout. The word felt like an understatement for the way I felt: depleted, disconnected, as if I'd lost pieces of myself along the way. He advised me to take time off, to rest, to consider whether the job was worth what it was doing to my health. But the idea of taking time off felt like a foreign concept. There was always more work to do, more demands waiting for me. And the thought of disappointing Julia, of admitting I couldn't handle it, filled me with dread. Still, the burnout persisted, growing worse by the day. I found myself at work, numb to everything, just going through the motions, no longer driven by any sense of purpose. It was as if the person I used to be, the one who'd been eager and bright-eyed, who'd dreamed of making a difference, had faded, replaced by someone who was barely holding it together. The breaking point came on a particularly chaotic Friday. I was finishing up a task when Julia called me over and handed me a new assignment. A set of financial reports she needed reviewed and revised by Monday. My hand shook as I took the file from her, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical burden. I knew I couldn't handle another weekend like the last one. Couldn't spend another 2 days chained to my laptop, watching the hours slip away. But, unable to say no, I took the file and headed back to my desk. By the end of the day, the office was empty. And I was alone. The dim overhead lights casting long shadows across the walls. I sat there, staring at the file. The sheer enormity of what was expected from me feeling insurmountable. And for the first time, I felt myself unraveling. The walls I'd built up to keep going crumbling under the weight of it all. In that moment, something in me shifted. I realized I was clinging to a job that had cost me my health, my peace, and pieces of my life I'd never get back. I looked at the file. The endless cycle of work that had drained me dry. And knew I couldn't keep going. For the first time, I let myself imagine a life outside those office walls. A life that wasn't dictated by Julia's expectations or last-minute deadlines. And for the first time, it didn't feel like an escape, it felt like freedom. I wish I could say that the tipping point was the last straw. But, as I learned, even breaking points have layers. After that night in the office, I returned to work the next week, promising myself I would do things differently. I was determined to set boundaries, to reclaim at least a small part of my life. But as the days wore on, I found myself sucked back into the same patterns, taking on projects that weren't mine, handling extra responsibilities with no recognition, and wearing myself thin just to keep up with Julia's expectations. One morning, I came in to find that the major project I'd been working on for weeks, the one I had nearly broken myself over, was being handled by someone else. I only found out when I saw Julia in the conference room, presenting the work I poured myself into, while another team member stood beside her, nodding along as if it had been their project all along. I felt a sharp pang of betrayal, mixed with a strange, hollow sense of inevitability. I was invisible, a background player in my own work. This wasn't just a matter of being overlooked, it was a deliberate erasure of everything I'd worked for. Julia barely acknowledged my contributions, reducing my weeks of effort to a footnote, as if I had only been there to assist rather than to lead. That moment left me feeling like a ghost in my own life. I had given everything to that project, sacrificed time, energy, even my health. And for what? So that someone else could take the credit while I faded into the background? The realization hit me hard. I had been working so hard for validation that would never come, chasing approval that was never meant to be mine. I was nothing more than a replaceable part in a machine that didn't care if I burned out or broke down. After that day, I started questioning everything I'd once believed about my work, my goals, and my sense of self. I thought back to the person I'd been when I first took the job, the one who was bright-eyed and hopeful, who believed that hard work would lead to success, recognition, maybe even fulfillment. That person felt like a stranger to me now, a version of myself that I had lost somewhere along the way. The truth was, I had allowed myself to be defined by the job, to measure my worth in terms of productivity and approval. Somewhere in the grind, I had lost sight of who I was beyond my role, forgetting that I was more than the tasks I completed or the projects I finished. The thought was both terrifying and freeing. For the first time, I was forced to confront the fact that maybe my self-worth didn't have to come from this job. That maybe there was a version of my life where I could be enough without meeting someone else's expectations. I spent weeks teetering on the edge, caught between the fear of letting go and the urge to walk away. My mind kept returning to the thought of freedom, to a life where my days weren't dictated by Julia's demands or last-minute deadlines. But each time I thought about leaving, I felt a familiar knot of fear of the unknown, of what might happen if I walked away from the security of a steady paycheck and the title that had, in a twisted way, become part of my identity. Gradually, I began to notice glimpses of what life could be like if I wasn't tethered to the job. I started going on walks in the evenings, a small act of defiance against the endless hours I'd once poured into my work. There was a freedom in those moments, a quiet reminder that life existed beyond the walls of my office, that I could reclaim pieces of myself if I was willing to let go. One evening, I sat down and wrote out a list of everything I wanted but didn't have a sense of peace. Time to pursue my passions, connections with friends and family that I'd neglected. I let myself imagine a life where I could have those things, where my worth wasn't defined by a job title or the approval of someone who barely acknowledged my existence. Each word I wrote felt like a small step toward freedom, a declaration that I was more than the sum of my work. It was on a Monday morning, after yet another sleepless night, that I finally knew I had to leave. I sat at my desk, the usual pile of unfinished tasks waiting for me, and felt an overwhelming sense of calm. I realized, with startling clarity, that I couldn't keep living this way. Couldn't keep sacrificing my health and my happiness for a job that had drained me dry. The decision didn't come with a dramatic gesture or a sudden epiphany. Instead, it was quiet, almost unremarkable, a simple acknowledgement of what I'd known all along. I sat there, my resignation letter open on my screen, and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had spent so long convincing myself that I had no choice, that I was trapped by responsibilities and expectations. But in that moment, I realized that the choice had always been mine. I just had to be brave enough to make it. I clicked send on the email. The one that would sever my ties to the job I had once been so desperate to keep. And as I watched the email leave my outbox, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The day after I resigned, I woke up with a sense of disbelief. As if I'd only imagined quitting. I spent the first few hours waiting for the usual buzz of emails and notifications to light up my phone. Bracing myself for Julia's voice to cut through my morning. Demanding something urgent. But there was nothing, just silence. The kind I hadn't heard in years. It felt strange. Unsettling even. But there was a peacefulness in that stillness. In the weeks that followed, I stumbled my way through a new rhythm. Slowly rebuilding a life that felt like my own. It was an odd process. Shedding the old routines and relearning how to spend my time. I started sleeping in. Letting myself wake up naturally without an alarm blaring me awake. I ate meals at the table. Not hunched over my laptop. Savoring food without the looming stress of deadlines. I took up running. Rediscovering the pleasure of moving at my own pace. Of feeling the crisp air fill my lungs as I ran through the park near my apartment. Financially, it wasn't easy. I'd saved up just enough to give myself a buffer. But the uncertainty was real. There were days I'd catch myself worrying about the future. Wondering if I'd made a mistake leaving the security of a paycheck. But each time, the doubt crept in. I reminded myself of why I'd left in the first place. I had spent years chasing approval. Sacrificing parts of myself for a job that had never truly valued me. Whatever lay ahead, I knew it had to be better than returning to that life. One of the most rewarding parts of this time was reconnecting with the people I'd sidelined during those years. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months were there, welcoming me back with open arms. I went to family gatherings. Spent weekends catching up with friends. Even rekindled a relationship with my partner. There was a sense of relief. A joy in being able to show up fully. Not distracted or exhausted by work. My conversations were no longer centered on stress and deadlines, but on laughter. Memories. And the small, meaningful details of life. In those moments, I remembered who I was outside of the job. Beyond the roles and titles I'd been clinging to. I started painting again. A hobby I'd abandoned years ago when work had taken over my life. The colors. The brushstrokes. The simple act of creating something for the sheer joy of it was like a piece of my soul had come back to life. I let myself explore other interests. Too. Dabbling in things I'd always been curious about but never had the time for. I read books. Volunteered. Took classes. Anything that filled me up instead of draining me. There were moments of clarity. Small revelations that came to me as I let myself just be. I realized that I didn't need a prestigious title or a high-powered job to be worthy. To feel whole. All I needed was to live in a way that honored my peace. My happiness. My values. It was liberating. Like I'd finally given myself permission to live on my terms. Free from the weight of someone else's expectations. As the months passed, I found myself reflecting more on the journey I'd taken. On the person I'd been and the person I was becoming. There were days I'd catch myself thinking about my old job. The years I'd spent pushing myself to the brink. Convinced that if I worked just a little harder, sacrificed a little more, I'd eventually find fulfillment. But looking back, I could see how misguided that belief had been. I didn't regret the lessons I'd learned. In many ways, that experience had taught me more about myself than any job ever could. It had shown me the cost of sacrificing too much. Of losing sight of my boundaries. Of placing my worth in something as fickle as a job title. I'd learned the hard way that no amount of recognition or success was worth compromising my well-being. My relationships. Or my sense of self. I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed. If I'd continued down that path. But deep down, I knew the answer. I'd seen it in the lives of colleagues who had never left. Who were still in that same building. Chained to the same demands. Watching their lives pass by in the shadow of someone else's expectations. Leaving hadn't been easy. But staying would have been a far greater sacrifice. In the end, I came away from that chapter with a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the courage to leave, but for the journey itself. That job had pushed me to my limits. Forcing me to confront parts of myself I might never have seen otherwise. It had shown me the dangers of living for someone else's approval and had, in a strange way, guided me back to my own voice. As I moved forward, I found myself drawn to opportunities that aligned with my values. Roles where I could work without compromising my well-being or my peace. I no longer measured success by someone else's standards. Instead, I focused on building a life that felt meaningful to me, a life where I could contribute, grow, and make a difference without sacrificing myself in the process. Looking back now, I can see that leaving wasn't just about walking away from a job. It was about reclaiming my life. About stepping back into myself and choosing a path that felt true to who I was. And as I think about the person I've become, I feel a deep, unshakable sense of peace. Knowing that I finally found my way home.